there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
Today, it is common for us to see women in leadership positions, in government, business, and other public spheres of life. But the steady advance in women's rights and responsibilities in American social life started with the passing of the 19th Amendment after World War I. Women's rights gained momentum, with women participating in the military during World War II, and continued in the 1960s with the birth of the modern women's rights movement. World War II was a significant event that showcased to the world women's ability to take on responsibilities that were once thought beyond them, and led to a dramatic change in women's rights. Over 350,000 women participated in World War II. Their valuable roles eventually helped women become a vital part of America's social and economic future. In the late 1930s, a woman's place was still very much at home. The roles of women were stereotypical at that time. Their responsibilities, for the most part, were limited to staying home, taking care of children, and having a good family life. But by the time World War II started, women had already begun their fight for equal rights. In 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, marking a milestone towards equal rights. But this did not ensure their equality with men. That change would have to await the events of World War II. The U.S. entered World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Many men left their factory jobs to serve in the military. The increased demand for military supplies forced the government to start a propaganda campaign calling for women to join the war effort. Thousands of women seized the opportunity to support the government's need and wanted the responsibility to protect the country. This eventually led to enhancement of women's rights and improvement in gender equality. When women began to join the military, the men were not initially too impressed.
She's crazy. What the devil's a woman want to be a soldier for?
Just a waste of time.
They thought women were being unfeminine.
This is a man's war. What sort of jobs can they do?
Some family members, even husbands, mothers, laughed at women who said they were thinking about getting a job.
As part of the Women in War Jobs campaign, in 1942, the government started a new effort to recruit women into the army, using a fictional character, Rosie the Riveter.
As proud as a girl could be, there's something true about red, white, and blue about Rosie the Riveter.
Rosie is shown flexing her arm and pulling up her sleeve to symbolize the potential of women, while saying, "We can do it," to the women of her time.
That's a very popular, well-known image from World War II. And it's probably the best-known image of a woman in World War II. And basically, since the war told women they could do jobs that had previously been men's jobs, and they could join the military, and they were strong enough to do those things.
Women's role in the war went well beyond the factories. They left small towns to take up high-paying defense industry jobs as well. By 1943, women were allowed to officially enlist in the military to meet its growing needs. They served in the Women's Army Corps in technical positions, in the Navy Waves, trained for emergency services, and in the SPARS, a unit in the Coast Guard, as radio operators and decoders. Lois Boughton served in World War II as a member of the SPARS from 1943 to 1945. She is also known as the Coast Guard Lady, and she's been writing motivational letters to the Coast Guard for over 40 years.
I was a radio man at a direction-finding station. We took bearings on ships when we heard them send messages. We felt we were doing what was really worthwhile when a ship in distress sent an SOS.
In the WASP, women pilots worked in non-combat positions. They flew planes to military bases so that the men could fly them into the battlefield. The establishment of these organizations by the government within the military showed legislative recognition of a woman's democratic right to join the armed forces. The roles that women played in World War II were very different from the ones they held in World War I. While the women in World War I mostly served in civilian volunteer positions, such as laundresses, mess cooks, and nurses. Women in World War II entered traditionally male career paths, such as working as factory workers, pilots, and mechanics. All these roles were outside the traditional gender expectations. This not only relieved the men from these jobs to go into combat duty, but also boosted women's confidence. World War II also helped African American women realize their potential. African American women enlisted in World War II as WACs and WAVES. Hundreds of women were assigned to the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, where they took pride in delivering mail to the troops, with a sense of common goal that reached across racial lines. Charity Adams was the first African American woman commanding officer of the battalion. Their experiences from World War II served to galvanize their fight against segregation and for equality as rightful American citizens in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. Later, this became a model for the women's rights movement. But the struggle for women's rights was not without its setbacks.
Women's advances generally didn't just come on a timeline. You start here and they just go perfectly to there. Women's advances, or the advances of other minorities, tend to come in sort of pendulum swings. So there's an advance and there's a retreat, and there's an advance and a retreat.
By the late 1940s, many women were forced to give up their jobs for the returning war veterans and return to their pre-war domestic roles. The 1950s therefore saw a temporary reversal of fortunes for women's rights, as women went from being Rosie the Riveter to Susie the Homemaker. However, World War II had given tremendous opportunities for women, both in the military and civilian jobs. This not only changed their perception of themselves, but also the public's perception of them. While there was no organized action during this time, women would not be silenced forever. By the 1960s, many women had college education and were ambitious. With the advent of labor-saving and time-saving home appliances, such as washing machines and dishwashers, some of the menial chores were removed. Women were frustrated staying at home. Betty Friedan's best-selling book, The Feminine Mystique, exposed the modern women's situation further.
The response to Betty Friedan's book actually became the spark that ignited what we call second wave women's rights. And my mom read The Feminine Mystique and she thought, my goodness, it really struck right at her heart. And after that, she became much more interested in going back to work.
As women entered the workforce, the difference in the social and economic status between men and women became clear to them. 1964 saw the Civil Rights Act being passed to protect women from being discriminated against in the work environment. A year later, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was appointed to implement the Civil Rights Act. In 1966, Betty Friedan founded the National Organization for Women to help incorporate women into the mainstream American society. She promoted equal pay for equal work, supported reproductive choices, and helped women campaign for political office. In the 1960s, the feminist groups implemented the ideas set forth by the popular student movements. It adapted their techniques of consciousness-raising protest demonstrations and political lobbying as the means to further their own agenda. Indisputably, women have increasingly advanced their rights. Women's participation in the labor force has increased from 14% in 1967 to 43% in 2009. There have also been important changes in laws related to equal employment, wages, divorce, and reproductive rights, all combining to ensure women are more liberated than ever. While the wage gap between men and women still persists, it has reduced substantially in the past several decades. These changes that we see today can be directly traced back to the women's rights movement of the 60s and in turn to the women of World War II. The new roles and responsibilities the women took on in World War II awakened them to realize their true potential, leading to better women's rights. As one looks back at the past several decades of women's progress towards equal rights, one can be reminded of Martin Luther King quoting an African slave preacher.
Lord, we ain't what we ought to be. We ain't what we want to be. We ain't what we gonna be. But thank God, we ain't what we was.